I love that. Thank you for greeting me back every evening. Is the volume all right in the back? Can you hear me? Great. I'll try not to fidget around as much today because I think yesterday the mic unhooked itself a bit. Okay, let's get started because this is a topic that is extremely dear to my heart. As you know from the lovely introduction in the first session, I am living in Glasgow, and Glasgow really is my adopted hometown. And I love, love, love the city and the architectural heritage from the time period that we are looking at. So what I'd like to do again today, just like yesterday, is to set the scene for getting an understanding of what Glasgow in the 1890s and the early 20th century looked like, who the patrons were, etc., and then we're going to look at some of the key buildings that Charles Rennie Mackintosh designed in the city. Again, it's a huge topic, and I had to make some exclusions, so there will be buildings that you were maybe hoping I would discuss, but I really had to just kind of contain it in an hour. So I hope that the buildings I've chosen are ones that you will enjoy. So as I said in my introduction already, within Britain, Glasgow was the one city that actually aligned itself very self-consciously with the stylistic developments that were taking place across continental Europe during the 1890s. So whereas the important artistic centers across the United Kingdom, such as, for example, London or Liverpool, actively rejected international Art Nouveau, Glasgow architects and designers actually actively sought contact with Europe and developed a modern style that we now call the Glasgow style or the Glasgow school. And I have a lovely quote from Walter Crane here, whom we've met twice already in our lectures. And he said, quote, "The strange decorative disease known as l'Art Nouveau has more to do with Glasgow than the Morris School," unquote. Didn't mince his words, did he? Oh, I think it's not turned on. Is Matthew still here? Oh, did it? No, I'll do it manually, not to worry. I have a little manual board here. So I'm showing you here a bird's eye view of Glasgow from approximately 1864. And this I put in because it makes us remember that during the late 19th century, Glasgow was the British Empire's second city. So after London, the second most important city. As manufacturing and industry were expanding, the population, people living in Glasgow, rose obviously in response to a need for labor force. So the kinds of industries that you found in Glasgow range from distilling, a good Scotch, to soap, glass, and textiles. And it's really during the first half of the 19th century that these were the predominant industries. And of course, we have to add into these industry, and because much of the wealth that actually Glasgow acquired was related to cotton. So the cotton industry throughout the 19th century provided actually over 1/3 of the jobs in the city. So we know, of course, for example, of the Lanark spinning mills, but also interestingly in Dumbarton, in the Vale of Leven, we have a really vibrant industry around calico printing of cotton, competing with India, and the famous turkey red dyes were developed there and produced. And from the 1850s onwards, the commerce shifted, though, the industries shifted, and iron, engineering, and of course shipbuilding became really the driving forces of Glasgow's wealth. And I'm showing you here a print with Robert Napier, who's of course one of the most important shipping magnates of the city. And Glasgow's shipyards were the birthplace for over 1/5 of the world's supply of ships from the end of the 19th century until the First World War. And so it's this demand for ships being built in Glasgow that gave rise to such famous families as the families around Robert Napier, Fairfield shipyards in Govan, and John Brown's shipyard in Clydebank. So shipbuilding, heavy engineering, and textile production really created the kind of thriving upper middle classes in Glasgow. And of course, these kinds of industries, especially the shipping industry, had a whole set of smaller ancillary industries that it spawned. So if you build a ship, you then obviously need highly skilled and specialized craftsmen and workers who furnish the ship. So the furnishing industry was really thriving in Glasgow. And there were many immigrants coming into the city to provide labor, this desperately needed labor. So we had immigrants coming from the Highlands, from Ireland, from Italy, and from Eastern Europe. And actually, many of the Eastern European immigrants were of Jewish origin, and they were actually fleeing some of the pogroms that were taking place there. So what I'm trying to say here and describe is just what a multicultural and diverse city late 19th century Glasgow was. Its arts, its theater, its music all boasted innovation and actually garnered worldwide respect. And its impressive cultural buildings reflected this vibrant life and this growth. So it's at this time that the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery is built. The amazing Gilbert Scott main campus of the University of Glasgow, my employer, is being built. And a little bit later, Mitchell Library, an absolutely amazing public library that also holds a lot of archival material that I work with, also comes into being. And we have, I'm just thinking of our lecture on Brussels yesterday, we have also one of the most popular parks in Scotland, and the People's Palace and Winter Gardens on Glasgow Greens, which is the name of the park, opening in 1898. So we're having leisure spaces and facilities for Glaswegians. And the government and the management of the city actually claimed to be one of the most progressive in the UK, providing telephone, water, and gas to its residents. And the two great exhibitions of 1888 and 1901 really put into international circulation this, or sort of demonstrated to an international audience, this incredible civic pride and the kind of municipal vision that really united industry, art, and science. And by this point in time, so by the sort of last decade of the 19th century, the city's economic and cultural progress seemed almost unstoppable. And almost 40% of Scotland's population was concentrated in the Clyde Valley. And the River Clyde is, of course, the famous river running through Glasgow. The Scottish social theorist Patrick Geddes observed that, quote, "No population in the world is now so predominantly urban." So he was a contemporary, he was of the time. So again, by the end of the 19th century, Glasgow was a truly modern city, and this is the context within which we must place Charles Rennie Mackintosh, Frances MacDonald, Margaret MacDonald, and Francis McNear, the so-called Glasgow Four. Because they were the leading designers of the day who made an invaluable contribution to the emergence of this Glasgow style, this modern international Art Nouveau manifestation in Glasgow. And this Glasgow style was internationally recognized. For example, we have a lot of international exhibitions on the continent to which the Glasgow Four are invited to contribute interiors. And we have the leading decorative art and architectural journals across Europe featuring photo essays and quite lengthy discussions of the Glasgow Four. And we, of course, have European patrons, such as, for example, Fritz Warndorfer in Vienna, commissioning Charles Rennie Mackintosh and Margaret MacDonald for designing interior spaces. And those of you who took my Vienna class will remember the music room quite well at Warndorfer's villa in Vienna. So contrary to their English contemporaries, Glasgow architects and designers did not reject the machine. And again, so very different from the arts and crafts ethos. The Glasgow Four really came out of an arts and crafts ethos, but contrary to William Morris and his like-minded disciples, the Glasgow Four, being products of this incredibly industrial city, of the city who's incredibly proud of its industries, they actually embraced the machine in making their objects. So they took pride in Glasgow's unrivaled feats of engineering. So the fourth bridge, for example, which was completed in 1889, was seen as a marvel and a thing of beauty, whilst William Morris considered it the, quote, supremest specimen of ugliness, unquote. And the Glasgow style appealed to and was supported by Glasgow's middle classes, the very industrial and mercantile classes who were these proud citizens of the empire's second city. And they really celebrated the kinds of infrastructure that had made Glasgow such a progressive, forward-looking city in the late 19th century. So it's a place that sports great civic pride. And also I should say that having consolidated their wealth over the past generation or two, it's the city's industrialists and mercantile classes who have sufficient funds and sufficient leisure time to support the arts. So we have a number of public and commercial exhibition venues springing up, such as the McClellan Galleries, the gallery was actually opened and built in 1855, but it became a really vibrant place to show the progressive arts. And we also have the Glasgow Institute of Fine Arts, as well as the City Art Gallery and Museum. And they are all very keen to offer the kinds of infrastructure that could support local talent, i.e. the emerging, up-and-coming progressive artists. There was also a really strong local network of dealers who fostered an appreciation of European and Oriental art while supporting local artists. And the individual I'm of course thinking of here is Alexander Reid, a Glasgow dealer who looked at the Glasgow Four and supported the local artists, but he also was looking to the continent, and he was Van Gogh's only British sitter. So we have a portrait of Alexander Reid from 1887 by Vincent van Gogh. And the last sort of context I want to offer you, and this is something we'll discuss as a building as well, is that most importantly for our discussion of the Glasgow Four, Glasgow was also the home of one of Britain's most progressive and pedagogically experimental art schools, the Glasgow School of Art, or the GSA as we call it. And it was under the directorship or under the regime of this individual, Francis Newbury. He was the headmaster and the director from 1885 to 1918, that quite drastic reforms took place in the way in which artists trained at the Glasgow School of Art. He emphasized individual training, and he made sure, or he tried to make sure, that the art school actually offered space where talent was recognized and could flourish. So for example, he introduced evening and Saturday morning classes, which enabled professionals to attend on a part-time basis. And he, of course, and this is why I'm showing you this drawing lesson on the right-hand slide, he also encouraged women to attend. Remember, those were the days where women weren't allowed to, or were only in very limited numbers allowed in art schools. He hired professional practitioners, so architects, designers, painters, on as teaching staff. And most importantly, again, for our discussion, he was very keen to erode the distinction, the sort of value judgment between art and design. And in this context, he started the Art Club, which is running to this very day in 1889, which was a place, and continues actually to be a place, where ideas could be exchanged between artists, designers, patrons, and critics. So as a result, this new curriculum, this forward-looking progressive curriculum, produced students such as E.A. Taylor, Ernest Archibald Taylor, who, and I'm showing you, he's very much working in the arts and crafts style, but I'm showing you his work as an example of someone who actually transitioned from being employed as a draftsman in the shipyards on the Clyde to becoming a designer of artistic furniture, stained glass, and interiors. So it was through this possibility of attending evening classes at the GSA, combined with the progressive curriculum, that someone who really would have, in the old days, remained a draftsman in the shipyards, actually became a very prominent and important craftsman in the city, with an international reputation, I should add. So this is the environment from which the Glasgow Four emerged, and it was actually at the Glasgow School of Art that the four of them met. And they met around 1892. And the individual that we will be focusing on today is Charles Rennie Mackintosh. So I wanted to just say a quick word about who he was. He's born in 1686 as the fourth of 11 children. His father was the superintendent of the City of Glasgow police, so he was very much born into a middle-class family. And it's around 1883, 1884 that Mackintosh, at the age of 15, began his training as an architect with the Glasgow office of John Hutchison. And this is a very typical route to take to become an architect in late 19th century Glasgow. You actually start a 5-year apprenticeship in an architectural practice, and the fees are usually paid by your family, or you have to find the money yourself. So in Charles Rennie Mackintosh's case, it was his father who paid the fees to Hutchison. And Hutchison was not an extraordinarily progressive architect. I'm showing you one of his designs here of a department store that he built. And, you know, of course, as happens so much these days, now it's housing Nike. And in 1889, roughly, we're not quite sure because the records are actually missing, Charles Rennie Mackintosh enrolled in the Glasgow School of Art to take evening classes in drawing, painting, and design. And he also did some architectural courses, and he enrolled in some courses on building construction. And as part of these studies, Mackintosh entered a number of class competitions, and I'm showing you here a design that he did during this time when he was an evening student at GSA for a science and art museum. So very conventional. You wouldn't think that he would end up becoming one of Europe's most important architects. It's around 1890 that Mackintosh leaves Hutchinson. We're not sure if Hutchinson wouldn't take him on as an assistant or if Mackintosh wanted to get out of this practice. Be that as it may, he starts working as an assistant and draftsman with John Honeyman and Keppie. And he actually stays with them and works his way up to become a named partner of the firm in 1904. So some of you might have come across Honeyman, Keppie, and Mackintosh as the architectural firm that is responsible for so many of Glasgow's important buildings. In 1913, we have, of course, it's the year before the First World War, we have economic difficulties. There's not enough work for the practice, and Mackintosh resigns and attempts to open his own practice, but unfortunately without much success, and his life really starts to spiral downwards from there. But it's the time that he was with Honeyman and Keppie that we are looking at. And another quick point I wanted to make is that while he was working at Honeyman and Keppie, he met Herbert McNair, the individual on the right-hand side in this slide, and it became a lifelong, although fraught, friendship, because Mackintosh was an alcoholic essentially, so he fell out with a lot of his friends and colleagues. So it's at the Glasgow School of Art that he meets the fellow students that would form this group that we call the Glasgow Four, namely Frances and Margaret MacDonald's, the two sisters. Oh, and because this thing isn't working, I don't have a pointer. Let me just see if I can find where it turns on. So you can see Frances MacDonald on the left-hand side. You can see Charles Rennie Mackintosh in the center in this photograph with the dapper tied scarf. And then you've got McNair next to him. And they became known, this group, we call them now the Glasgow Four, but they actually became known as the Immortals. And they started to work together. They were still going to evening classes at the art school, and this is the kinds of work that they produced. So they published a sort of student art journal called The Magazine. And you can see that these watercolors on the left-hand side by Frances MacDonald and on the right-hand side by Charles Rennie Mackintosh were very much influenced by Belgian symbolism, for example, or by symbolism in general, the kinds of work we looked at, for example, yesterday with Levin. And here is some of the collaborative some of the collaborative work that they continued to do throughout the 1890s. These repoussé panels by Margaret MacDonald. Do you think you could turn this on for me, please? Sorry about that. Oh, there it is. Okay. Duh. I looked everywhere but there. So these wonderful panels, repoussé is basically this technique of hammering often tin or copper to get this wonderfully animated material and surface. And you can see here the famous stylized Glasgow rose. And then we have a poster for an exhibition at the aforementioned Institute of Fine Arts that was produced by Frances MacDonald and Margaret MacDonald, as well as McNair. So this becomes a very tight group, not just of collaborators and fellow artists, but they also marry one another. So Margaret MacDonald marries Charles Rennie Mackintosh, and her sister Frances marries McNair. Margaret and Charles Rennie Mackintosh marry in 1900, and her sister and McNair married the previous year. Now, this kind of work did not receive a particularly positive reception in Glasgow, and before long, this group, the Immortals, were known as either the Spook School or the Ghoul, is that how you pronounce it? Ghoul, the Ghoul School, because of this distorted form that they experimented with. But let's now take a look at one of their first and early commissions for an interior. And this is the Glasgow Four were very closely aligned or affiliated with a particular patron throughout the 1890s, and that was Catherine Cranston, whom you see up here. And she was an amazing middle-class entrepreneur. She was a supporter of the temperance movement because Glasgow had, and continues, I would say, to this day, a bit of an issue with alcohol. So the temperance movement tried to steer workers and individuals and also middle-class patrons away from drinking in the pub and instead come to a tea room and drink non-alcoholic drinks and play billiard and pool there. So that's the temperance movement. And the Glasgow Four designed Miss Cranston's first tea room in Buchanan Street in 1897. And I'm showing you here some of a cartoon or sort of a drawing for the wall decorations that Mackintosh and Margaret MacDonald did for the Buchanan Street tea room. And Walton actually did some of the stained glass, another important Glasgow artist and designer. They then did a second tea room for her in 1900, the Ingram Street tea rooms. They don't exist anymore, neither do the Buchanan Street tea rooms. And you can see here, the slide I put up is actually a reconstruction that was commissioned by Glasgow Museums, basically the mother institution of Kelvin Grove, all museums in Glasgow. But this is designed for the Kelvin Grove Museum, and it's a reconstruction of the Ingram Street tea room. And you can see here already a distinct style of furniture emerging that would become the signature or the hallmark for Charles Rennie Mackintosh's chairs. And I'll talk a little bit more about his chairs in a moment, as well as this wonderful lamp right here, and these great gesso panels by Margaret MacDonald, which have survived and are in the museum. And they did a final one, the Willow Tea Room in 1903. And those of you who might have been in Glasgow, or my lovely audience members who are actually here from Glasgow, will be very familiar with the Willow Tea Rooms. This is a historical building, and I actually wanted to quickly mention today, you will have noticed that I put up a lot of black and white slides of the historical buildings, but I think when you look at architecture, it's these black and white slides when the buildings were in pristine condition that are actually really helpful for us to get an understanding of what they look like. And unfortunately, in this case, the building is owned by the city, and it's completely falling apart. The concrete is coming down, there's water ingress. So this building was not designed by Mackintosh, but the tea room, the room de luxe, was designed by Mackintosh and MacDonald. And again, I'm showing you a historical photograph of what it looked like, and then I'm showing you a photograph of what it looked like shortly before its closure last year. And you can see we have stained glass along the panel here, which is the row of windows you see right here. So the room de luxe is basically located right here. And you've got these wonderful high-backed chairs. And it's actually closed right now, the Willow Tea Room, but a wonderful woman has taken it upon herself to establish the Willow Tea Room Trust. And she's actually fundraising and has put a lot of her own money into restoring and preserving the Willow Tea Rooms, because I think over the past decades there's been a lot of fudging and sort of bad, we call it fakintosh, so sort of painting over things and sort of, yeah, that's what Mackintosh would have done. So she's going to strip it back once she's raised the money and bring it back to what it originally looked like. So you can see this development of the Glasgow 4 and of Macintosh in particular. They start out with watercolors and sort of experiment with a symbolist visual language. Margaret MacDonald would continue with that because she does a lot of embroidery and these gesso panels that I mentioned. But then they move into interior design, and then, of course, Macintosh becomes primarily known as an architect. But again, he's an architect who does the building as well as the interiors. So let's look at one of the earlier buildings that Macintosh built while at Honeyman and Cappy, and that's the Glasgow Herald building in 1893 to 1899. The Glasgow Herald is one of the oldest newspapers. And this is a new type of high-rise building that could be built in Glasgow because of, again, the kinds of technological advances that were being made. So we have electric lifts and structural steel that made it possible to bring the building up to this height. The facade of the building, even though it's so incredibly dirty right now, is red sandstone, and the sandstone was quarried near Dumfries, so it's Scottish sandstone. And sandstone, again, those of you who've been to Glasgow and who've walked through downtown Glasgow will know that red sandstone is a very prolific building material in the 1890s. Obviously, the most prominent feature of the Glasgow Herald building is the water tower. It's this right here. It's 44.5 meters tall, and it actually had a function. It was a working water tower, and it fed a whole system of roof drenchers, so a system of iron tubes that ran along the roof ridges and could supply water in case of a fire. Because in the actually all throughout the 19th century, Glasgow was notorious for fires. There were a lot of fires in Glasgow. And actually, I've lived there for 7 years now, and I would say it's still, compared to other cities I've lived in, there's an exceptional number of fires in Glasgow. The water tower is... Let's look at it. I think it's such a fantastic structure. And just as an aside, it's now called the Lighthouse, or yeah, it is. And the Lighthouse is actually, you can rent out spaces for conferences. It's sort of a permanent exhibition space, a little bit about Macintosh, but it's also, the building is open to the public. So you can actually go up onto the water tower, and you can walk up the steep staircase. So it's open to the public. The building is, I guess, what I'm saying in a roundabout way. The water tower is part of the building, so it doesn't have a separate identity until it emerges above the roof line, so up until this point right here, when it starts to corbel out. So it's these blocks projecting from the wall. It has some carved decorations, but very minimal. Can you see them right here? These stylized organic shapes. And each floor of the water tower has a small octagonal room, and then the top bit is basically open. So it's a quite vertigo-inducing experience to actually look up or down when you go up and down the staircase. Another building that is part of Macintosh's earlier practice is this wonderful Queen's Cross Church, which he designed between 1896 and 1899. And I don't have time to talk much about it, but I just wanted to draw your attention to this absolutely gorgeous, stylized blue stained glass heart in the former apse of the building. It's no longer used as a church. It's actually the seat of the Glasgow Macintosh Society, and you can also rent it out for functions. There's concerts in there, etc. Although sitting in a church pew for 2 hours listening to a concert is not the most comfortable thing to do. But let's turn to his most amazing educational/commercial building, and that is, of course, the Glasgow School of Art. I'm showing you here the famous north facade on Renfrew Street. Now, remember I was telling you that Francis Newbery was appointed the new director of the Glasgow School of Art in 1885. And he was really, the Glasgow School of Art was growing. It was attracting student bodies from all across the United Kingdom. And he wanted to move the school into a purpose-built structure. So in 1896, and of course, it took a long time to find some of the funding to convince the board that this is something that should be done. So 9 years after he was made director, he finally was able to call for a competition for a new building. And in this competition, he had two key requirements that will play out in the facade. One was that the main studios for the painters, the painting studios, would face north, because of course that's the crisp, clear, wonderful light that you need as a painter. And that the height of these painting studios would be at least 3/4 of the depth of the building. So again, very specific, right? So that the amount of light can be maximized that comes into the building. Now, he, as I said, had to raise the money. It was primarily financed through subscription from private donors. So the budget wasn't particularly, is it plentiful? Or it was a fairly low budget that he had to work with. And you will see the building actually ends up being constructed in 2 phases because they literally ran out of money. Because they kind of overestimated what they could do with the money that they had raised. Not that that sounds familiar to any of us, but also because Mackintosh just did not pay attention to any kind of budget he was given. He commissioned the kinds of craftsmen that he wanted. Now, Mackintosh had this famous saying where he said he wasn't precious about materials, he was precious about ideas. So it's not that he used expensive, ostentatious materials to furbish the Glasgow School of Art, but the amount of detail and craftsmanship that went into the building obviously did not come cheap. So he just, commissioned, and then all of a sudden there was no more money there to be spent. So here I'm showing you, it was built in 2 phases. 1897 to 1899 is basically when this section here was built. And then there was more fundraising and more convincing of maybe the city to chip some money in. We have then a second phase where this side, the rest of the building, is completed between 1906 and 1909. So you can see here in this wonderful computer imaging that was done, the 2 phases. So we've got the 1897, 1898 phase in the sort of brownish ochre, and the blue is the later phase. And you can see that in particularly the view from the southwest, this view right here, that the building was basically designed in the shape of a shallow E. Actually, you can see it up here as well. Can you see how this is like an E shape? And the walls, you can see that particularly well here, were ashlar walls, which basically means it was masonry in regular blocks. So again, this is a photograph that shows the first phase. This is, again, a historical photograph of the first phase. And here's the east elevation. So it's this bit right here that's not in the photograph that you can see right here. And as you can see, we have the huge studio windows that were stipulated by Newbery. They're square-headed, but without any mullions. And you can see these iron brackets right here, and I'll show you a detail. They're right here. They had no function, but they were purely decorative. And we have over the main entrance, I'm not sure. Yeah, you can see the main entrance right here. We have this wonderful architrave of two maidens flanking a rose tree. And again, it's the Glasgow rose, the sort of iconic symbol of the Glasgow Four, or the Glasgow style, really. And I think these maidens, these fluid forms, the long hair or veils, whatever it is, these enigmatic figures, harken back to the kinds of Belgian symbolism, for example, that we looked at yesterday. So let's look now at some slides of what the interior looks like. So here's then the second phase. So this is the library wing. This is the southwest. So this is... just show you, it's on this side here we're looking at now. So that's the second phase, and that's when the library went up. And I'm showing you a historical photograph because a famous photographer, Annan, photographed the building just as this was being completed. And this is the facade more recently. Here's the wonderful, so this facade with these amazing double-story windows, very sort of cathedral-like windows, held this beautiful Japanese-inspired space of the library. I would like to draw your attention to these chandeliers. It's often been said that they look like skyscrapers. The woodwork is actually Scott pine, so it's very run-of-the-mill, cheap pine, but that's, of course, then been stained. And here you can see this gallery, and the image, the photograph over here is actually taken down from the gallery. You can see the bookcases, as well as the custom-designed furniture. So it's been said that this is actually a Japanese-inspired interior, and I don't know if Suzanne is here, but I hope you agree with that. Yes. So just in terms of the color scheme, in terms of the proportions, in terms of these wonderful wooden pillars, it's a very when you're in the room, it really allows you to breathe. It's a very liberating, clean-lined, wonderful space. I'm now going to show you a series of black and white photographs because A, as I said, they really show the pristine nature of what the building looked like, and B, as I will talk about in a moment, the school actually burned, not to the ground, but there was a very serious fire in 2014, so a lot of the spaces we're looking at have actually been destroyed, and amongst them the library. So here's the boardroom from circa 1910. Remember, the second phase completed in 1909. Again, a boardroom, right? This is where the members of the board running the school, making the important decisions financially and otherwise, are gathering. So it's dark paneling. It's quite masculine, and Macintosh designed the furniture. And it's lovely how this echoes actually the paneling of the lead glass walls. This is the original boardroom, which was in the first completed phase, which has, by this point, 1910, being converted into a studio. And I just love the electric lighting, right? How all the wires are left bare and exposed. You can see the concrete structural beams on the top. And again, not the kind of bow windows we were looking at, still a bow window, but not as in Horta. We still open with a very minimal steel support. These are the more traditional panel type. And again, look at the wonderful inglenook kind of fireplace here with the stylized Glasgow heart. Since we're talking about an architect, I wanted to show you the architecture studio. Again, very functional, very sort of non-distracting. Get to work and have good lighting while you work. Here is the incredibly uncomfortable lecture hall. It looks very cozy and very lovely with the paneling, but boy, if you sit in there to listen to a lecture, it's really hardwood, very strange proportions. And here is this wonderful so-called hen run, and you can see it at the top here, just right here, so it goes basically this way. We don't have a photograph, so this is the glass bit right here. And it was called the hen run because there was a set of studios on one side, and the toilets for the girls or the ladies, the women, was on the other side. So you had these women who quickly had to duck out to go to the bathroom, running across this corridor. So that's why it's called the hen run. And this is what the hen run looked like right after the fire. So completely destroyed. So here is the library. This is what the library looked like after the fire. Here is a news photograph from the news coverage of the fire. Now, it's absolutely tragic that the fire happened. It's tragic that the kind of provisions that were in the art school did not offer sufficient, so the fire hoses, etc., the sprinkler system did not work sufficiently enough to prevent some of the horrendous damage. But the firefighters in Glasgow were heroic and saved as much of the building as they could. And I also wanted to say that one of the beauties of this space is that it has always been a working art school. It's not a museum. And one of the things that attracts people to the Glasgow School of Art is this very fact. It's not like a sarcophagus, a dead space. It's always full of students. And so the fire was actually started a day before the degree show was to go up, and a projector had a short circuit and lit up some sort of foam. So it was a student who actually started the fire, which on the one hand, can you imagine being that student? That would be just so horrendous. But on the other hand, I think it is just part of the life of the building that it was a working art school and not a mausoleum. The good that has come out of this is that the Glasgow School of Art has absolutely jumped into action in being committed to restoring the spaces, particularly the library, which is such a beloved space to so many of us living in Glasgow, and of course to so many visitors. So they actually hired archaeologists to excavate the space when it looked like this, and to catalog every little bits and pieces that they could find of the lamps, for example. So the lamps have been reconstructed, mostly from all of the little pieces that could be saved. And then there were, of course, some new materials that had to be added in. So it is going to come back. It's not going to be authentic or original, but it is going to be the same kind of space, because of course for a while there was a discussion, this being an art school, there was a real strong faction who wanted a new purpose-built building, not a throwback to the 19th century, but luckily that voice did not get too much traction. And the other good thing that came out of the fire, if there is anything that can be said to be good, is that the individuals, the architects working on this reconstruction have acquired so much knowledge about the actual way in which the Glasgow School of Art was built. So, for example, those wooden pillars in the library were always thought to be that, but there's actually they're hollow, and they just have a concrete and metal structure inside. So through this fire, we have learned a lot about Macintosh's actual building process and the craftsmanship. So not all is lost. So this is what it looks like right now. Good news is it's watertight. The roof has been put on. And the irony, of course, is that it burned down the very year that the building, the new purpose-built building, literally across the street from it, had opened. And that's Stephen Hall, the New York architect, the Reed building. Because, of course, the Glasgow School of Art is sort of growing and growing, so they needed new space. So this flashy new building went up, and then the minute that building was opened, 2 weeks later, the old one burns down. Yeah, I mean, okay, let's finish our lecture today by talking about one of his, in my opinion, most beautiful and successful domestic commission, and that is the Hill House. The Hill House is not in Glasgow proper. It's in a place called Helensburgh, which is roughly 37 kilometers west of Glasgow. It's a very affluent place. It's an affluent commuter town. It was a commuter town then, and it is a commuter town now. It was connected to the railway in 1857. And also being west of Glasgow, of course, in the late 19th century, it was the place where the coal smoke would not go. The coal smoke would blow east towards Edinburgh, and you know there's a big rivalry between the two cities, so all the dirt went east. And on the west you had the clean air, you had the view over the Firth of Clyde, and a lot of the wealthy industrialists and merchants, etc., had their homes in Helensburgh rather than the sort of smoky Glasgow. This particular home was built, it was a large detached family home. It was built for Walter Blackie, who is a really important and renowned publisher in late 19th century Glasgow. And he worked with many arts and crafts illustrators. So he worked very closely, for example, with Jessie M. King. Some of you might have come across her as a really important book illustrator. And here on sort of each side of Jessie M. King's Birth of the Infanta, I'm showing you covers of the kinds of books that Blackie published. So this is what they looked like. Beautiful objects in and of themselves. And Talvin Morris, the famous arts and craft designer, was actually the art director for Blackie in the 1890s. So Blackie himself moves very much within the kind of artistic circles that Mackintosh and the Glasgow Four and other designers are moving in. He's very supportive of this Glasgow style, although he, of course, himself is to be situated much more between arts and crafts and the Glasgow style. And Mackintosh and Blackie were actually quite friends is maybe pushing it a bit, but they had a good relationship, which again was quite unusual for Mackintosh because he was notorious for falling out with his clients. Now, Hill House was Mackintosh's most important domestic commission, but it wasn't obviously his first one. He had already built this wonderful house, Windy Hill, between 1900 and 1901. And the house was recently up for sale. I don't know if it's sold, but it's owned by a wonderful individual who actually furbished it in Mackintosh-style furniture. So the Hill House is not his first domestic commission, and it's now a National Trust property, so it's open to the public. Maybe we won't look at this. Let's look at this while we talk about this. Now, Blackie was impressed by Mackintosh's Glasgow School of Art, and he approached Mackintosh to design a family home for him, and they both wanted to build a house that was different from other houses in the vicinity. And when Mackintosh handed the house over to Blackie in 1904, he said the following, which is a lovely quote. He said, "Here is the house. It is not an Italian villa, an English mansion house, a Swiss chalet, or a Scotch castle. It is a dwelling house, unquote. So it's a home. It's a dwelling. The house is built out of snagged rubble. So basically a strong masonry wall that's built from different sized stones. And I'm showing you here a slide of the construction site, the building site. And it has, very typical for our region, a slate roof. It echoes it echoes Scottish vernacular architecture, so the kind of baronial houses. I think you can see, for example, here how some of the proportions and the towers are really echoing this Scotch baronial style, going from the 14th century to really the 17th century. Here is actually, and it's quite an imposing large house, but here is actually the entrance, which I think is a very humble but very solid entrance. And the doorway is covered by this very dominant or strong lintel right here. This is the main front, the main elevation in architecture speech, and it overlooks a wonderful garden. And you can see here, I think, in this photograph that there was an extraordinary variety of windows in terms of sizes and shapes, and how also some of the windows are pushed forward and others are recessed. So, but importantly, there's no windowsills anywhere to be found. So I would say this is a very carefully arranged asymmetry. So it's supposed to look quite accidental and asymmetrical, but it's of course very, very carefully thought out. There's nothing accidental about this elevation. It's a quite austere house because of course the stonework was then rendered with pebble plaster made from cement, gravel, and lime. So it's this very typical Scottish exterior, and it's caused a lot of problems actually because water is coming into the building. And it looks very different from the houses that are in its immediate neighborhood, for example, Brantwood or Mora, both built by William Leeper. So it's a very different kind of house. I know I'm a little bit running out of time, so let's look at some of the interiors. So here you come in, you can see the front door right here. You come into the entrance hall. Again, these wonderful Japanese, reminiscent of Japanese interiors in terms of the color scheme. As you can see, the dark wood, the dark stained wood, but also in terms of the proportions and the spacing. And of course, the ceiling is very reminiscent of Japanese traditional architecture. Here is the wonderful sitting room, which again features a gesso panel by Margaret MacDonald, and every piece of furniture in here is custom designed. And here you have this wonderful bay window which overlooks the garden, and the hot water pipes into the kitchen actually run under this settee. So when you sit there on a cold evening, you will be nice and cozy. So it's a modern house in many ways. Here's the dining room, and this is the one room that Mackintosh was not happy with because the Blackies, as progressive as they were, they came with the sort of furniture that they had inherited and the kind of china that they had inherited. So he had to make some sort of concessions in the dining room. So these are definitely not Mackintosh pieces of furniture. But I wanted to show you the dining room because of the wonderful light fixture designed by Mackintosh, as well as the kind of honing in of the historicist style by this rhythmic paneling that he put in. And lastly, this is Blackie right here. So this is a portrait of the patron. And here's the famous bedroom with, again, completely different from from the entrance in the hallway with this wonderful, clean, crisp, white color palette. We've got 2 textiles by Margaret MacDonald right here, and we have these famous dressers here, again with opaque glass in these pink tones and in these styles. Within Britain, Glasgow was the one city that actually aligned itself very self-consciously with the stylistic developments that were taking place across continental Europe during the 1890s. So whereas the important artistic centers across the United Kingdom, such as, for example, London or Liverpool, actively rejected international Art Nouveau, Glasgow architects and designers actually actively sought contact with Europe and developed a modern style that we now call the Glasgow style or the Glasgow school. And I have a lovely quote from Walter Crane here, whom we've met twice already in our lectures. And he said, quote, "The strange decorative disease known as l'Art Nouveau has more to do with Glasgow than the Morris School," unquote. Didn't mince his words, did he? Oh, I think it's not turned on. Is Matthew still here? Oh, did it? No, I'll do it manually, not to worry. I have a little manual board here. So I'm showing you here a bird's eye view of Glasgow from approximately 1864. And this I put in because it realized craftsmen and workers who furnish the ship. So the furnishing industry was really thriving in Glasgow. And there were many immigrants coming into the city to provide labor, this desperately needed labor. So we had immigrants coming from the Highlands, from Ireland, from Italy, and from Eastern Europe. And actually, many of the Eastern European immigrants were of Jewish origin, and they were actually fleeing some of the pogroms that were taking place there. So what I'm trying to say here and describe is just what a multicultural and diverse city late 19th century Glasgow was. Its arts, its theater, its music all boasted innovation and actually garnered worldwide respect. And its impressive cultural buildings reflected this vibrant life and this growth. So it's at this time that the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery is built. The amazing Gilbert Scott main campus of the University of Glasgow, my employer, is being built. And a little bit later, Mitchell Library, and absolutely amazing. It makes us remember that during the late 19th century, Glasgow was the British Empire's second city, so after London, the second most important city. As manufacturing and industry were expanding, the population, people living in Glasgow, rose obviously in response to a need for labor force. So the kinds of industries that you found in Glasgow range from distilling, a good Scotch, to soap, glass, and textiles. And it's really during the first half of the 19th century that these were the predominant industries. And of course, we have to add into these industry, and because much of the wealth that actually Glasgow acquired was related to cotton. So the cotton industry throughout the 19th century provided actually over 1/3 of the jobs in the city. So we know, of course, for example, of the Lanark spinning mills, but also interestingly in Dumbarton, in the Vale of Leven, we have a really vibrant industry around calico printing of cotton, competing with India, and the famous turkey red dyes were developed there and produced. And from the 1850s onwards, the commerce shifted, though, the industries shifted, and iron, engineering, and of course shipbuilding became really the driving forces of Glasgow's wealth. And I'm showing you here a print with Robert Napier, who's of course one of the most important shipping magnates of the city. And Glasgow's shipyards were the birthplace for over 1/5 of the world's supply of ships from the end of the 19th century until the First World War. And so it's this demand for ships being built in Glasgow that gave rise to such famous families as the families around Robert Napier, Fairfield shipyards in Govan, and John Brown's shipyard in Clydebank. So shipbuilding, heavy engineering, and textile production really created the kind of thriving upper middle classes in Glasgow. And of course, these kinds of industries, especially the shipping industry, had a whole set of smaller ancillary industries that it spawned. So if you build a ship, you then obviously need highly skilled and specialized. I love that. Thank you for greeting me back every evening. Is the volume all right in the back? Can you hear me? Great. I'll try not to fidget around as much today because I think yesterday the mic unhooked itself a bit. Okay, let's get started because this is a topic that is extremely dear to my heart. As you know from the lovely introduction in the first session, I am living in Glasgow, and Glasgow really is my adopted hometown. And I love, love, love the city and the architectural heritage from the time period that we are looking at. So what I'd like to do again today, just like yesterday, is to set the scene for getting an understanding of what Glasgow in the 1890s and the early 20th century looked like, who the patrons were, etc., and then we're going to look at some of the key buildings that Charles Rennie Mackintosh designed in the city. Again, it's a huge topic, and I had to make some exclusions, so there will be buildings that you were maybe hoping I would discuss, but I really had to just kind of contain it in an hour. So I hope that the buildings I've chosen are ones that you will enjoy. So as I said in my introduction already,